Frank could talk to the mountain. For 8 years, he'd lived alone in the Colorado Rockies, 50 miles from civilization, listening to the language of wind, understanding the meaning of snow sounds, reading the stories written in animal tracks. That morning, something was wrong. The eagles were flying differently. The deer were acting strange. The mountain was telling him something urgent. Someone is in danger. And Frank Thompson had learned to listen to what the mountain had to say. Welcome to Echo Stories. Before we begin this incredible story of survival and hidden heroism, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Today's story will remind you that the most extraordinary people often live in the most ordinary places, watching, listening, and ready to act when nature itself calls for help. The cabin sat at 9,200 feet elevation, nestled in a grove of aspen trees that turned gold every September. It was March now, and the snow was still 4 feet deep in most places. The nearest neighbor was 20 miles down a winding mountain road that became impassable for 6 months of the year. Frank Thompson, 67 years old, had called this place home for 8 years. A simple log cabin with solar panels, a wood stove, and a generator that he ran sparingly. Most people in the valley below thought he was crazy, a hermit who'd given up on civilization. They were wrong about the giving up part. Frank hadn't given up on anything. He'd just found something better. Every morning at dawn, Frank would step onto his porch and read the mountain like other people read newspapers. Today, March 15th, the reading was troubling. The ravens weren't calling from their usual perches. The wind carried sounds that didn't belong. And the elk. The elk were moving wrong, agitated, heading away from the high meadows where they should have been grazing. Frank had learned to trust these signs. 25 years as an Army Ranger had taught him that nature always told the truth. You just had to know how to listen. 40 miles away in the town of Evergreen, Colorado, panic was setting in at the ranger station. 3 University of Colorado students, Sarah Chen, Marcus Williams, and Jessica Torres, had been missing for 36 hours. They'd started what should have been a routine day hike on the Colorado Trail, planning to camp one night and return Monday morning. When they didn't show up for classes on Tuesday, their roommates called authorities. Ranger Beth Martinez was coordinating the search. Last GPS ping was here, she told the assembled search and rescue team, pointing to a map. That was Sunday afternoon at 3:47 p.m. Nothing since then. Weather's been bad up there, said SAR team leader Mike Rodriguez. Temperature dropped to -15 last night. If they're not properly equipped. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew the statistics. Exposure in the Colorado high country could kill in hours. We've got helicopter crews searching grid patterns, K-9 units on the ground, and every available volunteer, Beth continued. But visibility's been poor, and we're dealing with over 50 square miles of wilderness. What they didn't know was that the mountain had already found the missing students, and it was trying to tell someone who would understand. Frank stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the 20-degree air, watching a red-tailed hawk circle the same spot 3 times. Hawks don't waste energy. If it was circling, there was a reason. He walked to his equipment shed, a smaller building behind the cabin that most people assumed held firewood and tools. They weren't entirely wrong. It did hold tools, just not the kind they imagined. Inside, organized with military precision, were items that told a different story about Frank Thompson. Cold weather survival gear rated to -40. Climbing equipment that had seen use on 3 continents, a medical kit that could handle everything from hypothermia to traumatic injuries, and communications equipment that could reach civilization when needed. Frank pulled out his binoculars, military grade, capable of spotting movement at 2 miles. He scanned the direction the hawk had been circling, following ridgelines and gullies with the patience of someone who'd tracked both animals and enemies through terrain just like this. There. A flash of something that didn't belong. Bright blue against the white snow. Frank's trained eye picked out details others would miss. The irregular shape. The way snow had drifted around it. Something man-made and relatively recent. He checked his watch. 9:15 a.m. If someone was in trouble up there, time was running out. Frank loaded his pack with practiced efficiency. survival gear, medical supplies, emergency shelter, high-energy food. At 67, he moved with the fluid economy of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. The snowshoes were military surplus, lightweight aluminum with aggressive traction. Frank had modified them over the years, adding features that made them more suitable for rescue work in deep snow. The trail the students had taken was 4 miles from Frank's cabin, but he knew a more direct route. Ranger's path that cut straight up and over the ridge, saving 2 miles but requiring technical skills most hikers didn't possess. Frank climbed steadily, reading the mountain as he went. Wind patterns told him about weather changes coming in. Animal tracks revealed which routes were safest. Snow conditions showed him where avalanche danger was highest. An hour into the climb, he found the first sign. A granola bar wrapper partially buried in snow, fresh enough that it hadn't been through a full freeze-thaw cycle. 20 minutes later, footprints. 3 sets heading up the trail in good weather, but only 2 sets coming back down, and those tracks showed signs of panic. Longer strides, irregular spacing. Frank's pulse quickened. Someone had split off from the group, either voluntarily or because they couldn't continue. Following the trail became a master class in wilderness tracking. Frank read the story written in snow and broken branches. 3 hikers had started together Sunday morning. Somewhere around 11,000 feet, the weather had turned bad quickly, a common occurrence in Colorado mountains. The group had tried to descend, but one member, the lightest footprints, probably a female, had fallen behind. The other 2 had continued down, likely planning to get help. Frank found her in a natural wind shelter formed by fallen trees, where she'd crawled to escape the storm. Jessica Torres, 20 years old, hypothermic but alive. Her lips were blue, her speech slurred, but she was conscious. "Hi there," Frank said calmly, dropping his pack. "I'm Frank. I'm here to help." How did you—" Jessica's voice was weak. "The mountain told me you needed help," Frank said, already pulling out his emergency bivvy and heating pads. "I'm going to get you warm, then we're going to find your friends." As Frank worked, using techniques learned in Arctic warfare training decades ago, Jessica's condition stabilized. The emergency bivvy reflected her body heat back to her. The heating pads brought feeling back to her fingers and toes. "My friends," she whispered. "Sarah and Marcus. They went for help yesterday morning." Frank's heart sank. If they'd been traveling in this weather for over 24 hours. While Jessica recovered in the emergency shelter, Frank climbed higher, following the trail of the other 2 hikers. The story their tracks told wasn't good. Sarah and Marcus had made better time initially, but they'd also made critical mistakes. Instead of following the established trail, they'd tried to take what looked like a shortcut, a common error that killed experienced hikers every year in Colorado. The shortcut had led them into increasingly dangerous terrain. Frank found signs where they'd slipped on icy rocks, where they'd tried to backtrack, where they'd clearly become disoriented. At 11,500 feet, Frank found Marcus. The young man had fallen into a tree well, a hidden depression around the base of a large pine where snow hadn't accumulated as deeply. He'd been trapped there for hours, unable to climb out, his body heat melting the snow around him and making the situation worse. Marcus was in the early stages of severe hypothermia. His body was shutting down, but Frank had seen worse in Alaska, in Kosovo, in places where Army Rangers went to do jobs no one talked about afterward. Frank's emergency care was methodical and precise. Space blanket to stop heat loss, chemical heating pads against major arteries, high-energy glucose tablets to give the body fuel for generating heat. "Where's Sarah?" Frank asked as Marcus began to respond. She kept going. Said she'd get help." What day is this?" "Tuesday morning. You've been out here 2 nights. Marcus closed his eyes. "She's smaller than me. Less body mass. If I'm this bad." Frank didn't answer. He was already calculating times, distances, survival probabilities. None of the numbers looked good. Frank made a decision that would have been criticized by any official search and rescue manual. He left Marcus with emergency gear and a GPS beacon, then continued alone after Sarah. The trail was nearly impossible to follow now. Wind had erased most tracks, but Frank read the mountain in ways that didn't depend on footprints. He looked for broken branches at head height, disturbed snow patterns, places where someone might logically seek shelter. Sarah Chen had made it further than Frank expected, but she'd paid for every step. Her trail showed increasing confusion, the wandering patterns of someone losing core body temperature and cognitive function. Frank found her jacket first. She'd taken it off, a classic sign of severe hypothermia when the body's temperature regulation failed completely. Then, her boots, discarded as her feet went numb. She was in a creek bed, partially covered by snow that had drifted over her during the night. Frank initially thought he was too late, but when he checked for a pulse, he found one. Barely perceptible, irregular, but there. Frank had seen this before. In military medicine, they called it hibernation response, the body's last-ditch effort to preserve core functions by shutting down everything else. What happened next was 25 years of Army Ranger medical training compressed into 30 critical minutes. Frank worked with tools and techniques that weren't in any civilian first aid manual. He carried medications that most wilderness rescue teams didn't have access to. He knew procedures for treating extreme cold injuries that he'd learned in classified training exercises. The key was gradual rewarming. Too fast and Sarah's heart could stop. Too slow and cellular damage would become irreversible. Frank built an emergency shelter using techniques learned in Arctic warfare school. He created a microenvironment where he could control temperature and humidity. He monitored Sarah's vital signs with equipment that looked simple but was military grade. Slowly, carefully, he brought her back from the edge. When Sarah's eyes finally opened and focused on his face, Frank smiled. "Hi there, I'm Frank. The mountain sent me to find you." Getting 3 hypothermic college students off a 11,000-foot mountain in winter conditions required logistics that Frank planned like a military operation. First, he activated the GPS beacons he'd left with Marcus and Jessica, transmitting their locations to search and rescue teams below. Then, he did something that surprised everyone. He called in helicopter support using radio frequencies that civilian SAR teams didn't normally access. "This is Thompson, requesting immediate medical evacuation. 3 victims, coordinates following." His radio voice was calm, professional, using terminology that marked him as someone who'd done this before. The helicopter crew that responded was Air National Guard, military pilots used to difficult mountain rescues. When they saw Frank directing the operation with hand signals they recognized, they knew they weren't dealing with an ordinary civilian. "Sir," the flight medic asked as they loaded Sarah onto a stretcher. "What's your background?" Frank helped lift the stretcher into the aircraft. "I know mountains. I know people. Sometimes that's enough." The rescue made local news. 3 CU students saved after 2 days in mountain wilderness. Frank's name wasn't mentioned in most reports. The official credit went to the search and rescue team and the helicopter crew. Frank preferred it that way. But at the hospital, questions began to emerge. The emergency room doctor who treated the 3 students was puzzled by the quality of pre-hospital care they'd received. "Someone did outstanding field medicine up there," Dr. Patricia Williams told the sheriff's department. "Professional-level hypothermia treatment, advanced wilderness medicine techniques. This wasn't a lucky hiker with a first aid kit." Ranger Beth Martinez tracked down Frank at his cabin 3 days later, driving up the mountain road as far as she could, then hiking the last 2 miles on snowshoes. "I wanted to thank you personally," she said, standing on Frank's porch. "Mountain did most of the work," Frank replied. "I just listened." "My supervisor did some checking." Frank Thompson, Army Rangers, 1978 to 2003. Survival instructor, Arctic warfare specialist, 25 years of service. Frank nodded. "Different life." "Why didn't you tell the SAR team? We could have used your expertise from the beginning." Frank looked out at the peaks surrounding his cabin. "Because this way, 3 kids learned something about the mountain, and maybe next time they'll listen better." A week later, when the 3 students were released from the hospital, they drove up to Frank's cabin despite their parents' protests. "We wanted to thank you," Sarah said, still wrapped in winter gear despite the warming weather. "And to ask how you found us," Marcus added. The search teams had been looking for 2 days. Frank invited them in for coffee. The cabin was small but comfortable, filled with books about wildlife, weather patterns, and mountain ecology. On one wall, barely visible, hung a single framed photograph. Frank in Army uniform, 30 years younger, standing with his ranger unit. "The mountain talks," Frank told them. "Animals, weather, snow conditions, it all tells a story. You just have to learn the language." "Could you teach us?" Jessica asked. Frank considered this. "Mountain's a good teacher if you're willing to listen. Come back in spring when the snow melts. We'll take a walk." Word spread through the valley about Frank Thompson, not through newspapers or social media, but the way news travels in mountain communities, neighbor to neighbor, story by story. Parents started pointing out Frank's cabin to their children during summer hikes. "That's where the man lives who saved those college kids." The local ranger station quietly added Frank's radio frequency to their emergency contact list. Other hikers began stopping by his cabin, asking for advice about routes, weather conditions, safety protocols. Frank helped when he could, always emphasizing the same message. Respect the mountain, learn to read its signs, never assume you know more than the wilderness. Alone on his porch in the evenings, Frank would watch the peaks turn pink in the alpenglow and reflect on the choices that had brought him here. He'd spent 25 years as a ranger, serving in places where mountains were obstacles to overcome, terrain to conquer. It had taken 8 years of living alone in the Colorado Rockies to understand that mountains weren't enemies to defeat. They were teachers, if you were humble enough to learn. The 3 college students had received a gift that day, not just their lives, but a lesson about listening to something larger than themselves. Frank hoped they'd remember it. 6 months later, when summer brought easier travel and warmer weather, Sarah, Marcus, and Jessica returned to Frank's cabin as promised. He took them on a 3-day wilderness education course, teaching them to read weather signs, track animals, understand how snow behaved in different conditions. "Why do you live up here alone?" Sarah asked on their last evening, as they sat around a campfire Frank had built using techniques that left no trace. Frank looked up at the stars, visible here in ways they never were in the city. "Because the mountain has things to teach, and cities are too loud to hear them." "What kinds of things?" "Patience, humility, the difference between what you need and what you want." He stirred the fire with a stick. "And sometimes, when someone's in trouble." "How to find them?" Marcus asked. "Do you ever miss the army?" "I miss the brotherhood, but I found a different kind of family up here." Frank gestured toward the peaks around them. "The mountain takes care of those who learn to take care of it." And so, in the Colorado Rockies, it was proven once again that the most powerful protectors often live in the most remote places. Frank Thompson wasn't hiding from the world. He was learning from it in ways that only silence and solitude could teach. Real heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes they carry snowshoes and listen to the wind, ready to answer when the mountain calls for help. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe stories like this should continue to be told, support Echo Stories by subscribing. See you in the next video. And remember, the most extraordinary people often live in the most ordinary places, watching and listening, ready to help when help is needed most.